Hey there, Ninja. I'm Stephanie from fearlessfresh.com, and today we're going to talk about how long to cook pork chops. Now, this is a great question because pork is one of those meats that really does not like to be overcooked. And honestly, one of the biggest questions I get from my students in the Fearless Cooking Club is how long do I cook like X cut of meat, right? How long do I cook pork? How long do I cook beef? How long do I cook fish? How long do I cook chicken? Now, pork in particular is really sensitive to overcooking. And I've included all the details you need to know on this page, or a link to it somewhere on this page so you can find them and print them out there. But I'm going to explain a little bit of it here just so I know that you understand what's going on. So pork is actually red meat. A lot of people don't know that. They think it's white meat because of that damn commercial that was going around for years, pork, the other white meat. Pork is actually red meat. Right? And red meat, when you overcook it, like the fibers tend to separate, and when you eat them, they get stuck between your teeth, and it's really not very good. But the problem with pork is a lot of people are really paranoid about getting sick, right? Which makes sense. Like we have the risk of E. coli, we have the risk of trichinosis, all these things that the USDA and the FDA have warned us about. But the good news is, there's not really so much of a risk of trichinosis anymore. The government has done a lot to eradicate trichinosis in our food supply. So it's not as big a concern as it used to be, though you still don't want to just ignore the risk out of hand. But the USDA and the Food and Drug Administration have actually lowered the temperature that pork needs to be cooked to. So we can actually eat pork at medium texture without any risk, which is great news, which means you can cook your pork to 145 degrees Fahrenheit to 150 degrees Fahrenheit without any risk. But here's the thing with cooking meat, right? You can't cook it to 145 degrees and have it stay at 145 degrees when it's done. That's just not how cooking anything works, right? That's not how cooking meat works. That's not even how cooking a cake works, right? So the way it works when you cook something, when you heat something, the heat energy moves around the thing that you're cooking, and it moves inwards to penetrate to the middle of the object, whether it be a roast or a pork chop or a cake or a loaf of bread, whatever it is you're cooking, right? So you take the thing out of the oven or away from the heat source, and it's actually going to continue cooking after you've taken it out of the heat. The reason for that is when you take it out of the oven or you take it out of the pan, like the heat energy in the piece of meat doesn't just magically disappear. What happens is the meat energy in the thing that you're cooking actually continues to penetrate to the middle for, anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes, up to an hour, depending on what it is that you're cooking, right? If you're cooking a huge roast, like we call this carryover cooking, and that carryover cooking can actually occur for quite a bit of time. But for just like a little thing like a pork chop or a steak, actually carryover cooking should be done within like 7 or 8 minutes. So generally what you want to do to accommodate for this is to take the meat out of the oven earlier. Right? Because what happens is if you take the meat out of, say you want your pork finished at 145 degrees Fahrenheit, if you measure the pork with a thermometer and it says 145 degrees, you take it out, by the time you let it sit there and rest, it's actually going to be like 152 degrees, and it's going to be a little bit overcooked. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our pork chop out 5 degrees earlier. Now what's going to happen after you take your pork out of the oven and you let it rest for a few minutes, it's going to go from 140 degrees to 141, 142, 143, 144, 145, and probably 146 to 147. The funny thing is you can actually watch this happening. If you don't believe me, you can insert a probe thermometer into your meat and just let it sit there for 5 minutes and watch as the temperature continues to go up and up and up with the more time that passes. Now, obviously, if you let it sit there any longer than that, it's going to start to cool off again, right? If you want your meat hot, you want to eat it relatively quickly. But generally, the rule is to take it out for just a steak or a pork chop or a thinner piece of meat 5 degrees before it's at the temperature you want it at when it's finished, and then let it carry over cook for 5 more minutes to come fully up to temperature. Now, when it comes to measuring the temperature of your pork, there's a couple different options you can choose. Like you can just use a standard probe thermometer and stick it in the pork while it's cooking when you think it's done to read its temperature. But I personally like having a probe thermometer with a little wire that comes out of the oven, and it has a little digital interface that attaches to it. And you set an alarm on the digital interface, which is so handy because it beeps when it tells you that it's done. And the reason why this is a game changer is, like, I don't know about you, but I tend to get really distracted when I'm doing more than one thing at once, right? So if I'm like making pork and then I'm making a side and maybe I'm working on something for dessert, or, having a glass of wine, or there's people over and they want to talk, right? It can really quickly get to be too much, and then I forget about the pork in the oven, right? And that's a problem. And so if you set the little probe thermometer with the wire and put it in the oven with the pork, you just basically insert it in the pork like you would to test it like in the moment. And then the little wire comes out and attaches to the alarm, and the thing beeps when it's at the perfect temperature, and you don't have to worry about forgetting it. It's really incredible. Now there's one more really important thing I need to tell you about cooking perfect pork, and that is about salt, right? So salt is so important when it comes to cooking meat. Now, when you're cooking meat, whether it be pork or chicken or beef, this does not go for fish because fish is much more delicate. But when you're cooking like land roaming animals, you want to salt your meat anywhere from 12 to 24 hours ahead of time. This is doubly true for roasts, but when it comes to like a steak or a pork chop, you generally want to salt minimum 12 hours beforehand, up to 24. Now, if you forget and it's like, 2 hours before, well, 2 hours, salting your meat 2 hours before is better than salting your meat 10 minutes before. So if you forget, or, you've already got your meat out and you're just now hearing this, just salt it now, right? Because the earlier you salt it, the better. And what this allows to happen is the salt on the surface of the meat, you want to be fairly generous, or you put the salt on the surface of the meat, and what happens is the salt starts to penetrate the meat via osmosis, and it goes all the way to the middle of the meat, which means every bite of your meat is seasoned, which makes it perfect, right? Like if you just put salt on the surface, what happens is only the surface is salted. So you take a bite and it still tastes good, right? Because it's got some salt on it, right? But like if the salt has penetrated the meat all the way to the middle, that means that the salt is evenly distributed throughout the entire piece of meat, and it's so much more satisfying. It just tastes better. It really brings out the flavor of the meat. And honestly, you really don't need much more than salt and pepper at that point. You don't need to add fancy sauces or spices. You can if you want, but I can tell you that if you salt your meat ahead of time, it can be the difference between a pretty good piece of meat and a, oh my God, what did I do differently? This piece of meat is delicious. It's always the salt. So somewhere on this page, you'll find either a link to the tutorial and recipe or the recipe and tutorial itself. The recipe is located on fearlessfresh.com, and Fearless Fresh is the place to go if you want to become a faster, more effective, more creative home cook. Have a good one.